So happy you guys have come here to learn about tree propagation and tree planting. Before we get started and introduce our two speakers, I wanted to do a land acknowledgement. So, in the spirit of reconciliation, the New Brunswick Environment Network acknowledges that this work takes place on the unceded, unsurrendered, and stolen homelands of the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, Penobscot, Abenaki, and Pescamaquoddy. That is part of the Wabanaki Confederacy and its homelands, and is covered by the historic treaties of peace and friendship, which were co-developed and signed by the Wabanaki Confederacy and the British Crown in the 18th century. The NBN pays respect to the Indigenous and First Nations of the Wabanaki Confederacy, who have occupied these lands for over 12,000 years in the past, present, and future. All right. So to start off today's webinar, I would like to introduce Amanda Schoonmaker. She's here to talk to us about cluster planting, which is a new way it challenges the way we plant trees. I found her paper about a year ago, was really excited, and I told myself I would invite her to speak to you sometime. So here we are. Here you go, Amanda.
Okay, now we're gonna make this all work as beautifully as it worked before. Good. All right. Oh, yeah, you're over here now. All right. I think we're all organized now. So thank you, Natalie, for inviting me today to talk a little bit about cluster planting and land reclamation. And I do also have a small land acknowledgement just to build on the one already presented. And that really reflects here in Alberta, NAIT main campus is located in Edmonton. They're on Treaty 6. And in fact, where I work at the NAIT Center for Boreal Research, it's in Peace River, we're in Treaty 8. So this place is a traditional homeland for the First Nations and Métis people. And today we are all part of this treaty land. The traditional name of this place, and this is Treaty 6, is Amisquachi Waskagan, which we also call the city of Edmonton. And again, there's a long history that has brought us to be on this land. And because we're online today, I encourage you all to take a moment to reflect on the lands where you are and the people who live in it. And a couple more acknowledgements for all of the folks that have been engaged in the work that we're speaking about today. Study contributors. I'm not going to be talking so much about the science today. This is a picture-heavy visual presentation, but Mark Ba-Aschenfor, Simon Landhauser, and Brad Pino have all been involved in this cluster planting trial work over the last several years and contributed to the experimental design. And in Mark's case, he did a lot of measurement monitoring. NSERC, the National Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, also supported this work through a grant awarded to NAIT. We have two industry partners that have contributed and provided the study sites towards this project. And a special thanks to Robert Albrecht and Rochelle Harding, because they really advocated for doing this work out on these in situ facilities, and as well as many of the research staff that have helped measure things, and the students that have worked tirelessly on this project over the years. It hasn't in Northern Canada. We also have to be conscientious that we apply reclamation approaches that are going to positively contribute to forestry development once those extraction activities are completed. Fires are very much a part of the boreal landscape. Here in Western Canada, I think actually across Canada, we all felt fires this year in different ways, shapes, and forms. 2023 was awful from a landscape scale disturbance viewpoint, but it does also put us in perspective in terms of where humans sit relative to nature. Stand replacing disturbances, are certainly ubiquitous on the boreal landscape. And we can learn from these landscapes. So when we think about land reclamation and forest reclamation, we can use analogs and fires to help guide some of our methods of reclamation. Something that's really important when we look at these, fire origin stands is that canopy closure concept. So post-fire in many of these northern systems, either conifers seed in very heavily and regenerate up at high density, or hardwood species, deciduous species sucker back very quickly. And we get canopy closure in relatively fast time in these natural systems. So this is, again, nearly ubiquitous in fire origin stands in the boreal, as well as many harvest origin stands if they have a deciduous component. So, what can we learn from that? So deciduous species. Here in Western Canada, I'm speaking primarily about Populus tremuloides, Betula papyrifera, and Populus balsamifera. So in Eastern Canada, there's going to be a slightly different mix of species, though I think aspen is part of that landscape, and certainly paper birch. But you have other species that I'm not very familiar with. So keep this in mind that these are all species that have the ability to either sucker from the extensive root system or stump sucker. So paper birch generally stump suckers. So when you cut it down, it sends up a bunch of new shoots for its stump, but both aspen and balsam poplar will sucker from their roots. So this helps them proliferate really readily on these sites post-disturbance, and helps them occupy that space. So why cluster planting? So I'm speaking about putting trees in denser clusters than we normally do, because typically nursery tree seedlings are planted uniformly across reclaimed industrial sites. Certainly in post-harvest sites, that's how we plant conifers. Even spacing to maximize individual tree growth. This is where the idea of that conventional uniform planting comes from, because in forestry, we want productive conifer growth. So it makes sense, maximize that space between the individuals so that we can get good uniform tree development. But post-reclamation in an industrial setting is very different than post-harvest. This severity of disturbance is much more severe. Soils are altered. We have lots of agronomic, non-native vegetation pressure early on, and it can be very difficult to get these species up, and closing canopy very quickly can take a long time. So we thought to ourselves, well, what if we cluster some of these trees? What if, rather than doing this uniform planting approach, we concentrate the effort? The alternative, of course, would be to plant 10 or 20,000 stems per hectare uniformly across the site. This can be done, but this becomes almost cost prohibitive in many operations. So, what's the next best thing? Well, let's try some tight clusters and see what happens. And actually, there's some literature on this. I'm not going to really go into it here in the name of time, but I believe these slides will be shared afterwards. There's some good papers that have looked at this cluster planting concept for other reasons across Europe and the southern US. So when you cluster plant things, I have an example here of the effect of the size of the cluster, and then the effect of how you space trees within the cluster. And this is the design that we tested in our research experiment. So we looked at first making the cluster smaller, so 3 meter by 3 meter clusters, 5 by 5, 7.5 by 7.5, or uniform planting. And all of this as an effective density of 5,000 stems per hectare. And so when we look at different size clusters, we're keeping the space between trees and the individual clusters the same, but what ends up happening is the unplanted space between the clusters changes. So if you have only a few trees clustered together, you only have about 4 meters of gap between those clusters. But if you do a 7.5 size cluster, it's a lot of trees, 121 trees, I believe, in a 7.5 by 7.5 at 0.75 meter spacing. So you end up having about 8 meters of gap between those clusters. So you have to think about that too. And this is something we wanted to test. Conversely, if you then instead of modifying the cluster size, let's take a 5 by 5 meter cluster, and you actually change the spacing so that maybe you get canopy closure a little faster, a little slower. This also has similar impacts on how that unplanted space between clusters is going to behave. So with that, I think I'm on time here. Yes. So I'm going to speak a little bit about this ongoing research project. So we have 2 study sites. They were established in 1 year and then in another year. So Conoco site was in 2017. The CNOC site was in 2018. They're very similar experimental design, with the exception that the CNOC site actually had some vegetation control applied to the clustered plots because of the ruderal weed issues we tend to find on these sites. We actually did a pre and post emergent herbicide the day prior to stock planting, and you will see the effect of that in the images over time. It's actually allowed the trees to grow faster on that study site. So earthworks happened the year before. There's a lot more methodology and data collection in the early phase of the project in another presentation that I gave 2 or 3 years ago, and it's available through this YouTube link. So it talks more about the early data collection specific to this trial. But for today, we're just going to look at some pictures. So these are the experimental designs, messy, lots of little plots and blocks. And if we look at the CNOC cluster trial, you can see the different cluster sizes and then what the gaps look like in between them. But we'll move on to the images here. So if we take the CNOC site, so this image was taken in June 2023, so about 6 years post-planting, and we can see lots of clusters on this site. So this is different size clusters because it's a cluster experiment, but you see lots of clustering. And a little bit as an aside, this area actually burned in 2016, so 2 years prior to planting. And visually, the burned area around the site shares a lot of kind of remote imagery similarity to some of our clusters. So our 6-year-old clusters, which are 2 years younger than the post-burn areas, are showing some visual structural similarity, which is really neat to see. So how does this look relative to uniform planting? I show here in the red boxes where we have uniform planting plots. So that's just put everything at about 1.5 meters spacing instead of these clustered plots. And you can see there's lots of variability. So there is definitely slower growth in the middle part of the site and much higher rates of growth on the edges. And you see that in the uniform planting treatments. This plot here is growing very fast. This one's growing slow. This one's growing slow. This one's growing a little faster. This one's a little bit in between. But I think the visual is apparent, is given within a similar area of the site, the clustered treatments have closed canopy now. So we actually have a little patch of trees. This little patch of trees may serve wildlife that want to get some shade or get some protection on this otherwise pretty exposed site. It may encourage other kinds of plants to come into it, and just creates a bit of different structural diversity. This is a couple of images from the Conoco site. And so this is about 7 years post-treatment. The Conoco site didn't have that vegetation competition control, so things were growing a little slower out there. But we are seeing the clusters pop through. And again, the red rectangles are where we've uniformly planted. And you can see here, for the most part, uniform planting is really lagging in terms of that canopy closure, with the exception of this area here. And this is a very special little spot. This is where the soil was stockpiled originally. And I've seen this a few times. Wherever we get these stockpiled soil areas and then we remove the soil, we always get really good growth underneath these stockpiled areas. And there's probably some good reasons for it that I can't dive into it. In fact, I don't know. But we tend to see this pattern. But overall, we're seeing the same effect. Where we cluster it, we're actually getting some of that forest canopy structure coming much sooner than with uniform planting. What is the effect of these different types of clusters. This next image just shows a little cute color coding scheme of the different experimental cluster sizes and cluster spacings. And I think the big one that stands out to me is probably the 3 meter by 3 meter spacing. So these ones in red here, they're probably too small of a cluster to be very functional. And again, you know, we see here throughout, some of these clusters are doing better than others. Early competition was a big issue in this particular area. So you know, clusters are going at varying paces of growth, but these larger clusters are tending to give us that structural diversity a little bit faster. So I think that might be an outcome that's going to come out of this project. We're going back into it this summer to do I guess it's a year 7 remeasurement, and we'll have more data at that time. Again, competition matters. So this is at the Conoco site. This was a high competition area. Not many trees after 4 years are surviving in this cluster. And then same site, low competition area. There just wasn't as many ruderal weeds here, and the trees are doing much better. We see lots of really neat things happening in terms of biodiversity. Lots of big wasp nests were attaching to the paper birch in these tree clusters that we didn't see happening in the control or the uniform treatment planting. So I don't know if those nests really liked having more protection around them by having those clustered trees, but we definitely saw lots of nests. Had to be careful where we were stepping. Yeah, competition has an effect. I think I'm a little bit out of time here, so I'm going to keep moving. Suffice to say that this little rectangle here is the image 7 years later. This image was taken at year 2 in that same location. I will not forget that location. It was crazy. It was one of the worst sweet clover spots I've had to navigate through, and it just wipes out these trees. So we do need to be conscientious about this in land reclamation. And again, in terms of practical outcomes, so just a couple of outcomes here. You know, one, I think that's apparent is we're getting a shorter timeline to canopy closure at the sort of microsite scale, at that small scale. It's not uniform across the site, but we're getting structural diversity faster. This is one potential outcome of a cluster planting approach. Cluster planting gives us other options. So in some regions, and I take this example of coal mining, this is coal mining in an area that's largely agriculture, but they have some requirements for forestry establishment. If you cluster plant your trees, you may still be able to do more weed management around those clusters as they're coming up, and gives you a few more options that way. So you can concentrate your trees in patches and then continue to manage around them while those tree clusters are developing. You create different kinds of diversity. So in this example here, this is, I think, around year 4 after planting. There's a tree cluster here. And then I just point out all the different things we planted between the clusters. So we've created different kinds of structural diversity and have some open grown condition and some more eventually closed canopy condition with an array of species. And then my last point is the opportunity to promote infilling. So, you know, right now this trial is just these clusters of trees. We planted the odd shrub and white spruce between them. But what if we cut the edge trees down and then let the roots sucker out and actually fill the gap in? And then we might actually have full canopy closure on these sites much earlier. This is actually something I want to test. I want other people to test. With that, I'm going to sign off. Hopefully I'm not too much over time. And I'm happy to take any questions. I'm going to drink some water.
Thanks so much, Amanda. We have some time for some questions. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat or raise your virtual hands. Give everyone a minute to think about their questions if they have anything. And also, Amanda, if you have any, oh, we have a Frank Johnson here with a question. So feel free to speak, Frank.
Hello. How does this contrast with the Japanese practice of sort of a tense mini forest for urban reforestation? And
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Uh, uh, I mispronounced it, the Mikalanki forests. And the your do you anticipate management of these mini forests, cluster forests, to the degree that you would perhaps thin at some point? What happens when they become older?
Yeah, good questions. Thank you, Frank. So to your first one, yes, I think this conceptually shares similarity to the Japanese approach in I just lost the word, but anyway, in cities, in urban areas. And I think they're taking a more holistic mini forest approach. So if I understand, I've read a little bit about that approach, but they're creating trees in the middle, and then they tend to have other types of understory species, sometimes around the edge, sometimes nested underneath. So theirs are, in essence, tend to be higher biodiversity than what I've been testing, or what our team has been testing in these trials. I would say one is not better than the other, comes to objectives. So where we have tried to put other diversity is actually between the clusters. So I think the Japanese approach tends to put all of the diversity in and around that cluster. But we try to put these deciduous tree species that like to grow together, that close canopy quickly, that can sucker. We put them together, and then we put some of these other species in the gaps around them. So some of the shrubs, conifers, things like this. I don't see necessarily doing management. I think in this situation, in the land reclamation context, we let nature take its course. So as that little patch of trees grows, oh, got some hearts. This happens with my computer. I'm on a Mac, and I get these little bubbles of animation. But anyway, where was I going with that thought? So as these trees develop and close canopy, there will be competition, and there will be self-thinning. But in this context, having some of these trees die back and then contribute coarse woody material to the site probably has value of in itself, and is going to create different kinds of habitat for other things. So I wouldn't necessarily advocate for thinning them, but I would advocate for thinning around the edges to promote suckering, so that you could potentially close some of those gaps over time if that was a goal and objective that way. So it's different than sort of productive forestry, right? This is about trying to get as much of that native vegetation occupying these sites as possible over a relatively short time frame. I hope that
Thank you very
answers your
much.
question. Yeah. Should I answer the questions, Natalie, in the chat? Or go through them one by one?
Sure, yeah, go ahead. If you want to go
Sure.
start with the first one, I think the first question is similar to the last question, but not sure.
Yes, yeah, I think so. Yeah, with tiny forest planting. Yeah, I think I answered that with Frank's question. So yeah, so less diversity because we're spreading the diversity in the gaps. We're really just trying, in this case, we're trying to create some vertical structure quickly. That's really the intention at a patch scale, because we are not planting 10 or 20,000 stems per hectare uniformly. I'm not saying you can't do that. You can do that, but it just comes at significant cost. And what weed
Sure.
suppression method was used is the next question from Sergey. At the conical site, there was no weed suppression method used, but at the CNOC site, it was a combination of a pre and post-emergent herbicide. So it was glyphosate mixed with a product called Torpedo. Torpedo inhibits seed-based regeneration. So we've done a fair bit of testing with Torpedo. We need to publish some of our work actually on this topic, but you can plant into it with nursery stock seedlings. Doesn't seem to affect them. Really inhibits things coming out of the seed bank. So you need to be conscientious how you use that product, because it will inhibit seed-based regeneration of native species as well. So, but if you're in a situation where you have lots of agronomic weeds and you're applying it at a patch scale, there might be a nice balance there. So, should we answer another one or move on to Mary's presentation?
No, you still have some time.
Oh, okay,
Yeah, we have 5 minutes,
good.
so go ahead. I think the next one was Turner, which is any suggestions on how cluster planning could differ or be similar with silver maples in floodplains in Brunswick. So she's with the Nashwauk Watershed, and I know they're doing a lot of floodplain planting.
Yeah, so I kind of figured something like this would come up with species I don't know. So I don't know a lot about maples. All we have here is a bit of Manitoba maple, Acer. Dropped the full scientific name there. But I think if your deciduous species is anything like the group that we're using, it should work well. Most deciduous species that we work with tend to be relatively fast growing. I mean, they double conifers in height in the early years, though conifers may catch up over time, but their early growth is quite quick. So the maples should respond positively to it. And especially if in these floodplain systems, you're having problems with weed management, with grass management, floodplains are going to be rich conditions, competitive conditions. So getting your trees a little more concentrated may give you other management options in the short term. So get that cluster of trees up, concentrate the effort on those clusters, let the area around it do its thing. And then once they're up, then potentially you could look at either, cutting some of them and letting them sucker if they sucker, or doing other things in the gap. So I think it's worth testing. Always test it, in my view. I hope that answers your question, Kate. And Tegan, were each of your clusters single species? Oh, I didn't go into this. They were always a mix. So in this particular trial, we planted all 3 species together. And again, like I didn't have enough time to go into too much of the detail on it, but our mix was half paper birch. And then it was 25% aspen and 25% balsam poplar. And I like to say it's because we had a very well thought out plan on that mix, but it was actually about what we could get for seedlings at that time. So I like paper birch and balsam poplar in land reclamation. They tend to tolerate competition better than aspen does as a seedling. Aspen, Populus tremuloides, is very competitive once it's established. So post-harvest, aspen's never a problem. She always comes back, right? But as a seedling, it tends not to always be consistently strong. It wasn't in either of the trial years. So even where we controlled competition, the aspen was pretty mixed bag on response. So the benefit for us of planting that mix was hedging our bets. So I could have, I would have liked to have seen maybe a little bit more balsam poplar rather than half paper birch, but it worked okay in this context. I would always advocate for mixed species because of the interannual variability. You don't know what your conditions of the year are going to bring you. And I am always humbled. Every year, every trial, I get humbled a little bit more by nature and what variability or what constraint or what insect is going to come and try to wipe out my poor little seedlings. So it tends to vary over time. And putting this mix of species in helps you deal with that unknown factor, because generally one of the 3 or 2 will usually do well, even if the other one doesn't. So it's risk management. And diversity is good.
All right, I think that actually we're right on time. If anybody has more questions for Amanda, we can have more time after the next presentation. Amanda, if you don't mind popping in the chat, maybe some links to the paper you published or anything you'd like to share with people if they want to look into it a little bit further.
Sure, can do. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. All right, now I want to introduce Mary Knockwood. Mary Knockwood, I'm excited to have you talk because I've been really interested in the program you're doing. So you're originally from Fort Folly First Nation, but you now live in Nova Scotia. And you are in charge of the Indigenous program. No, you're the Indigenous program coordinator for the Atlantic Forestry Center. So I'm really interested to learn more about that program. And also, you're here to talk to us about Indigenous values and supporting the collection and preservation of species. So this also touches on the other webinars that we'll be doing, where we'll be talking about propagation through seeds and in other propagations. So I want us to kind of keep in mind, the Indigenous values in that and the holistic ways of being. So thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you. Walalia. I'm going to share my screen. Go here. Watch it not work this time. Come on, go. Ah, there we go. Display. Are you seeing just the...
You still need to swap to the slideshow. Yeah.
There
we go. Thank you.
Woohoo. So thank you for inviting me to come here to speak regarding the Indigenous Seed Collections Program. And yes, I come to you from Nova Scotia, the lands of the Mi'kmaq, unsurrendered lands of the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia. But I work for the National Tree Seed Center, or I work with the National Tree Seed Center on the Indigenous Seed Collections Program, which is national in scope. So I'd like to also acknowledge all of the treaty lands, along with all of the people living within those lands across Canada, and acknowledging the diversity of all of those people. So yes. So I'm here to speak about the diversity of species and looking at trees and including Indigenous values within that whole thing, and looking at successional species as well. I'm going to speak about the Indigenous Seed Collections Program that was born out of that knowledge, where Indigenous people have been the stewards of our landscapes for millennia, and were the original ecosystem architects of this great land that we now call the Americas. We were the earliest seed collectors, processors, and distributors of those seeds all across our lands. So the ISCP, the Indigenous Seed Collections Program, was first announced on the spring equinox of 2022. So March 22nd, it was that year. And it supports community-specific paths in their storage of their genetic legacy through the co-development of an Indigenous seed collections program. We will achieve this through supporting the empowering of our Indigenous communities across Canada to preserve Indigenous knowledge, conserve species of cultural, spiritual, and economic importance. I'd also like to note that we're also working with them to preserve those species to help with preserving their language as well. So understanding the Indigenous values in ethical harvesting, what does that look like? Well, the program will focus on species that are cultural, medicinal, spiritual, and economic importance to the Indigenous communities, along with those under threat by current forest pests, pathogens, and climate change related concerns. As the original ecosystem architects, Indigenous people are the earliest seed collectors, and we have been seeing a lot of those issues due to climate change and the introduction of species that have been impacting our species. And where there are 600 First Nation and Inuit and Métis communities and over 60 different languages, that is very diverse in scope, where there's lots of different practices and traditions. And incorporating those Indigenous values is very vital to be successful. But how can we make that better? How can we help increase a more sustainable way of collecting seeds? And that's what the Indigenous Seed Collections Program is hoping at achieving through creating networks and working with Indigenous communities. So the first species that really brought the Indigenous communities to the National Tree Seed Center of Natural Resources Canada, due to the introduction of the emerald ash borer, and a lot of Nova Scotia communities were seeing the loss of their treasured species of the black ash, which is used for not only basketry and tools and implements, but also has a medicinal value as well. They were seeing that they were losing the uses, the traditions, but also the language around the use and collection of those species of the black ash, and working with it, making baskets or the tools. So the language would no longer be used around it. So losing all that, they decided they needed to find ways to bring it back, to be able to start looking at saving the species through the collection of seeds. They reached out to the National Tree Seed Center and started working with them on collections and storage of those seeds. So on August 10th, Donnie McPhee, who is the coordinator of the National Tree Seed Center, he set out on an 11-week journey spanning 20,000 kilometers across Canada. The trip was set to make over 50 stops along the way, with 22 of those being Indigenous groups. Stops included dialogue with the provincial seed centers, regional forest genetic programs, beginning in Quebec and ending in British Columbia. He traveled in his RV, hauling a trailer with a bunch of equipment so that he could demonstrate collection techniques and show processing techniques, and left some communities with some tools and whatnot in hopes of kickstarting their seed collection efforts. Other NTSC staff also went to different parts across Canada. We had Melissa Spearing, which is next. She went through the Southwest Nova Scotia, Southwestern Ontario communities. And she was very excited by working with them and learning new information from these groups, as well as Donnie did as well with his groups that he met all across Canada. And we also had other techs working across the Atlantic, as we see here, Katie working and doing some training in Miabugak in Newfoundland. So we're looking at working together, developing opportunities for networking, learning, and sharing, linking Indigenous groups, communities, and organizations with Natural Resources Canada's scientists that are working on subjects of concern or interest to those communities or your communities. So we've also been having training sessions with the communities that we've already worked with. We've been hosting lab sessions where Indigenous communities will send potential participants to learn about the way we process things, the tools we use, and also our techs are also learning from all of these participants on ways to ensure that their harvesting of seeds is honorable. This is another one of our in-lab and field training posters that we did to kind of show that we've first started with a field training session and then moved to the training lab session with our communities. And from that, you can see that we've had, oh, now my computer's syncing. Next one. Okay, I've been having computer issues, so please bear with me. It is now thinking. I knew this was going to happen. It was too good to be true. Anyway, I'll keep talking. So, oh, there we go. So we've had several different training sessions in the lab. We've had 3 each fiscal year, and I'm showing just one here of 2023. I think I got them out of order here. And then we have also one of 2024. Oh no, they're in order. Okay. So this is the one we just had recently. And we've had 6 communities basically on almost all of our sessions all across Canada. We've had them from Blueberry River, Aski Reclamation, which is the Saulteaux Nation. Here we have Cold Lake, we have Winnemagee Institute of Natural Resources, and MTI here in New Brunswick, Guyana, which is in Ontario, Split Rock, which is also in BC. It's so beautiful to watch these sessions happen because there's so much networking happening and establishing connections with each other to make that network strong. And we're hoping to forward that connection through further meetings. So in June of 2023, we're invited to host a workshop at the RE3 in Quebec City, where we were presenting on a toolkit being developed by Dr. Andrew Judge. That toolkit was looking at helping both the National Tree Seed Center and the Indigenous communities to work together on seed collections. The first portion of this session that we had, or this workshop we had at the RE3, Dr. Andrew Judge provided insights on a classroom setting or presentation setting, on Indigenous perspectives on viewing the world and the importance of understanding the interconnectedness of all living beings, which is important to note on how important that is to our people, but also in the seed collecting world as well, because we need to ensure that we're honoring the spirit of the land and the seeds and the trees, and that it's not only trees, that it's everything within the forest. After he had the presentation portion of it, we went into the Longhouse in Wendake, and we had a really beautiful discussion around sitting around the fire. And Dr. Andrew Judge was talking and telling stories about some of the lessons that we've learned across the Canada, from stories that were heard from the Across Canada Indigenous Seed Collections Tour, some of the lessons that were learned and some common solutions going forward to restoration, relations with the land and each other via seeds. It was so beautiful. The people were so excited and to learn from each other. What was also really nice to know too is that this workshop provided a space for learning, reflection, and inspiration, emphasizing on the importance of collaboration, long-term planning, and sharing of knowledge in the context of seed preservation and environmental stewardship. What also was really beautiful to see was that we had a whole class of youth that came to this session. They were a class from Bedford, Nova Scotia. The teacher had gotten all of his students to come to the RE3 because they had a bee garden, and they were talking about that. And then they heard about the National Tree Seed Center and the Indigenous Seed Collections Program and the session that we were hosting. So they were excited to join, and they all registered. So this is also showing and that it's very important to ensure that you're bringing youth into the fold, ensuring that there is a intergenerational input and guidance for everything that we do. Because as an Indigenous woman, I've learned a long time ago that everything I do affects 7 generations ahead and more. So another thing that the Indigenous Seed Collections Program is teaching our techs. And this is so beautiful because I was out in the field with Kieran Balk, one of our techs, and he was so excited. He saw a toad. He says, "Oh, you got to take a picture of me with this toad." And it's showing, the importance that there is so much more in a forest than just the trees. And yellow birch, this is a yellow birch catkin, and this is what we were collecting in Newfoundland when we went out to Newfoundland because it was such a bumper crop. But it's also showing that there is such a large diversity of seeds that come from the forest and off the land. They come in many different forms, different sizes and shapes, which all need different styles of collecting, processing, and storage. This is a beautiful shot, also showing intergenerational learning and training. This was a session that was held out in BC, and you can see even they brought their babies out. And when Donnie was at this is Donnie here, the one on with the kind of black hat on the end. He was so excited about, you know, this child. The mother let him hold the baby, and he sent me a picture right away to say, "Oh my God, look, this gorgeous little baby, and the baby's learning too." And he started laughing about it. So I'm also posting here a bunch of mentions and stories that were posted on the Indigenous Seed Collections Program, from the CBC to global to stuff that was released on the newswire. So I put some links here so that if you guys would like to kind of take a look at some of those links and stuff to see about what was said and whatnot, you can. And also, just to kind of give you an idea, when you're looking at species that were identified to date from communities, it's more than just trees. They look at the land and the forest as a whole. So you're seeing your small shrubs and whatnot, like juniper and willows and soapberry, but you're also seeing raspberries, you're seeing currants and gooseberries, and you're seeing the larger trees, the white ash, the birches, you're seeing roses and buttercups and fireweeds. They all make up that environment. So to have a healthy environment, to have a healthy ecosystem, you need to take the whole ecosystem as a whole and how they work together. A good example of that, I could say, would be like looking at your forest and then going out and looking at a tree and looking at how many lichen are on that tree. Lichen are a keystone species to monitoring the health of your forest, because a lot of lichens have a really long life. They need to have very old forest to be able to continue on reproducing. So if you don't have the right conditions for that lichen, you're not going to have a healthy ecosystem for those lichen to continue. And that's pretty much it for me. So, Walalia, thank you, merci, and questions.
Thank you so much, Mary. Those photos are really interesting. As I put in the chat, I lichen. I recently was skiing in the woods, and I wiped out because I was trying to admire some lichen on a tree, and as is normal for me. And I thought it was interesting, the seed from the yellow birch that you showed us. I don't think I've ever seen that before, even though yellow birch are one of my favorite trees. Maybe they're just too high up for me to see them.
They're very high.
Yeah, I'll be keeping an eye out for those.
Yeah, and what's really interesting to note too is that not all species fruit every year. If you look at the black ash, it takes 7 to 9 years for a tree to go to seed. The hemlocks every 3 to 4 years, right? So I mean, you got to realize, you got to learn about your species. You got to monitor them. You got to start getting quite familiar with them to understand, when's the right time to go out and harvest seed off of them too, right? So yeah, you got to build that relationship with your species that you're collecting from, just as you do with human beings, because they too are spirits in this world, on this land, that provide for us. So
that's it. I have so much to learn. So if anyone has any questions, please raise the virtual hand or pop it in the chat. I'll give you guys a little minute.
I am going to downsize this a bit so I can see. I think I'm going to. There we go. Oh,
If no one's asking a question, mine would be, do you guys have anything exciting planned with that program in the coming year too?
Say that again. Sorry, I was just working on my.
Do you have anything exciting coming up in this program too in 2024?
I went out to the Yukon last year. It wasn't a good seed year in the Yukon, so we weren't going out to go collecting seed and work with the communities there. But there was also a lot of wildfires out in the northern part of Canada that a lot of areas were more concerned with trying to protect the communities and whatnot. So they have asked us to come out this year to work with them on looking at the successional species and fire resilient species and start collecting on seeds from those trees. And one of those species was the aspen, because they had learned that the aspen are very resilient when it comes to fires and coming back and whatnot. So they are looking to collect aspen seeds to be able to start bringing them faster and quicker into the areas. There was also talk about some of the fire smart areas, and there was concern about how some fire smart areas aren't working as well as they should be. And so they're wondering if there's ways that maybe the Indigenous seed collection program and looking at those species within the area that could help make those fire safe smart areas work better. So it was kind of interesting about that. We're working also trying to get out to Alberta, because we've had a number of participants at our lab training sessions that are looking to have us come out and do more in-depth field training sessions with them as well. So that's kind of exciting as well. And we've worked all across Canada. We've had lots of sessions in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. We've had two. We're looking at having more in New Brunswick this coming year. So MTI has requested us to do several training sessions with their communities. So it's an all across Canada thing, and there's not enough people within the National Tree Seed Center to ensure that we're able to get to all of them. So we have to kind of set our schedule so that we can capture as many as we can with the money that we have.
Yeah, of course.
And I see Amanda, you have your hand up.
I'm hoping I can ask a question, even
Sure.
not official attendee. When you were speaking about the youth, it bubbled a thought to my brain that has there been any discussion within your group about creating like a high school training module or high school course to try to
we are looking at that, and what we've been doing right now is kind of doing some research to find out what has already been done out there, and then reaching out. We got to also reach out to the people that developed these things to see if we're able to utilize the aspects of those training modules to see if we can manipulate them to fit what we do. But we also have to meet with schools and whatnot to find out how curriculum can be included into their science curriculum base already, right? So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, even if you could make an elective for it,
yeah, that would be exciting.
it would just and get exposure to so many
Yeah.
more people.
Yeah, and I think the thing for me though, what's really scary is a lot of youth right now don't have any faith in us as adults, because they see so much devastation in the world going to, excuse the language here, but to hell in a handbag. And they don't think that we're taking concern for their future. And so everything I do, I work towards trying to ensure that they know that there is at least one adult out here that is working to try to help their future, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
we need to have their voice, and we need to hear it. We need to have it heard loudly. So
Well, and giving them more knowledge at a younger
exactly.
age, because no one gets exposure to these types of biological topics in high
No, they
school.
don't.
Biology is focused on human anatomy. I never took
Mhm.
high school biology because it was so boring.
I didn't take it either, so
No, and yeah, here we are, right? So yeah, it's weird the way the world takes you. But yeah, it would be great to see more of that infused in and get more people involved at that younger age. So
Yeah,
Okay.
another really important thing too is like you were talking about your block and your cluster planting and stuff. I wonder, do you actually reach out to Indigenous groups and elders to find out if there's other species other than the trees that could be brought into your clusters that might be successful?
Yes, this is a good point. So what we have done, so these projects are located within operating in situ facilities. So communications with the Indigenous communities in the area are done through those company relationships, but those groups have been coming out to see these sites over the years and to get that exact perspective, right? To understand, is this useful? Should we be doing things differently or better or whatever that might be? Because that's how we learn. I'm just a scientist with my viewpoint and where I come from, but I want to understand where others come from as well. And one of those tours, the fellow brought up a point I hadn't even considered, because I'm not a hunter. So he walked into this site, and at the time it was about 5 years old, and he's like, this site is great. It has tree structure, so the wildlife feel protected here, so that the ungulates will come and bed down near these tree patches, but then there's still some grass and like places for me to clean meat and do the things
Nice.
I want to do hunting wise. And I never looked at it from that perspective. So to your point, yes, that engagement is important, and getting that feedback and then incorporating that into additional design, or even incorporating that into how reclamation happens, because that site was also not being easily approved for certification because of there was a little bit of noxious weeds, but it was meeting value for other reasons that are not reflected in our reclamation criteria right now. So we
Right.
need to do more things like that to understand what's going to be useful. So
Agreed.
yes, we should do more.
Yes.
Probably.
Tegan, you have your hand up, Tegan?
Thank you, Mary. I'm wondering, I work at or teach a middle school class here up in Knowlesville, and they're really eager. We've been doing some little diversification kind of implanting with some shrubs and different plantings over the last couple of years. But is there opportunities to come down to Fredericton? Because you're so close, like we're about an hour away. Could we come and see get a tour and understand what the tree seed?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Reach out to me. Nat has my contact info. Reach out to me and I will find out. Give me some times to work with, and I will find out what works for the center.
That's amazing, because it's so amazing just to see everything you're doing. So thank you so much for sharing.
My pleasure. I guess that's it. Oh, wait a minute.
We got another
Winston.
question.
Yes, my father always talked about hard pine. Now, I'm 70 years old and he was 40 years old when I was born, so that's quite a while ago. But hard pine is, as I understand it, Pinus rigida, pitch pine. And I sent a sample from some of the buildings around here to Sackville to the dendrochronology lab, and they did a paper on that quite a few years ago. And it's my opinion that that tree used to grow around here, but it no longer grows. I wonder if the indigenous people have any knowledge of a pine other than the white pine, the red pine, and the jack pine that grow now. Have you ever heard of something like that?
Not off the top of my head, but it's possible. That would be something we could probably reach out to our contacts that we have to see if they know of anything like that. But personally, no, I'm not aware of. I started learning about pine when I was younger, but it wasn't a lot. There was only like a couple of pine species that my dad ever told me about. So yeah, pitch pine was not one of them.
Well, I can't seem to get anybody interested in look, I mean, the guy in Sackville that does that lab, he's so busy he can't take time to do it, but and I don't, everybody seems to think it can't possibly be. But the
Yeah,
old
well,
fellers knew trees, and you're like the old farmers, the old settlers here knew trees a lot more than people do now. And if they said there was a different kind of pine, I would kind of believe them. So I don't know. I'd like to see somebody look at that, but I don't know what else I can do about it.
we
Pitch
could
pine is
ask. We could ask. I can ask my contacts if any from New Brunswick if any of them have heard of pitch pine. They might know it as something else, so I might have to look for pictures and whatnot. So that might have to be distributed as well, because pitch pine is not an Indigenous name, and we named things for the way we used it. So it might be known in another word. So yeah. Thank you, Zahari. No, Zahira.
Zahira,
Oh,
yes.
look at that. Even
That's what
Amanda too. Yeah, so I'll reach out. I'll ask Nat for your contact info, and I will get back to you if I hear anything.
I
I'd appreciate that.
I also put Mary's contact info in the chat, Winston, if you want to reach out to her.
Okay. Maybe I could send her that paper that they wrote in Sackville about pitch pine would be like its name says, it's full of pitch, and it's a very hard, strong. It's harder and stronger than the regular pines that we see growing here.
from what I'm
And
seeing from
I think
the
that you
distribution here, just sorry to cut in there, was just that it does come up into the main area. So I imagine it wouldn't be, it makes sense that it would cross into New Brunswick.
It would make sense, yeah. True enough.
I think they used it to caulk ships when they were building ships in this area, and because you can heat it up and get the pitch out of it. And I think that's a use that they would cut every tree they could possibly find, and that's where it disappeared. But again, that's just my idea. So I don't know. It'd be
I've heard
interesting.
stories too that there I don't know what type it was, but there is stories that I've heard when I was younger that they used to do the same thing. They used to have big huge vats in southeastern New Brunswick, where they would boil and boil and boil for days on end just to get the sap and well enough to use for sealing the boats and the ships. So I don't know if that was pitch pine or not, but I've heard stories.
Thank you, Winston. I've got a Frank Johnson has a question, but also I wanted to say if anyone now that if anyone has questions also for Amanda that they remembered, feel free to raise your hand for that too.
My point about pitch pines has been made twice already. I remember seeing them, in my early teens in the Upper St. John River Valley.
Oh, nice.
All right. Anyone else have any questions?
If you don't feel comfortable asking here, as Natalie said, there's my email in the chat. Feel free to contact me. Very reachable, and I usually respond.
Amanda, did you put your email in the chat too? If anybody has any questions to ask you, if they think of something later.
Yeah, I can do that.
Perfect. There we go. All right. Well, I think if no one else has anything to do, we can conclude this webinar. I feel really grateful to have both Mary and Amanda come and talk to us. I think I've learned a lot, and I've also learned that I have more to learn. So thank you so much.
Thank
you.
you.
Well,